One of the biggest mistakes that people make is putting the blade in the wrong spot.
I got tagged in this video, and this isn't to belittle Snodgrass, who runs the circuit, selling Carter's products and who else. So he's a salesman. So if you haven't seen his video, what he's claiming you to do is to place the depth of the gullet at the arc of the crown on the bandsaw. And what he's claiming is that the tension on that blade can cause it to do that. Go watch his video. Here's why it's not really braced in physics. The pressure is really only here. And he's talking about the action here at the side. So when you tension a saw blade, it's really here, and the tire is soft. The crown is very shallow, and so it doesn't really, it's not going to make, you're not going to have different tensions across a spring steel blade. Like, there's no difference in tension. So that's kind of crappy, okay? Now what's terrible about the idea is that what he's doing is reducing the capacity of your saw, because you're never going to be able to use a saw blade the width of your wheel, which most manufacturers, that's what their specifications is. If your wheel's an inch thick, you can run an inch blade. Worse than that, though, is he's only describing the upper blade. The upper blade, you should have that in place. But the upper blade tilts for tracking, and really the crown is there to track. That's not to place the blade in the right or wrong position. It is to track the blade. And so what happens is, if you track, and you can only track up here, and so you might put the gullet up here, but at the base of the saw, that wheel doesn't tilt. It's only going to affect where it is there. So he's going to, what, he's going to tell you that the base of the wheel doesn't affect, because it's only going to push your blade to the back. Now the worst part is, he's got his blade pretty much shoved to the back, which means the blade is just off of the crown. Which means when you go to tons and tons of force onto your thrust bearing, your thrust bearing is going to keep your blade from falling off the back. Let me explain what is well, in every manual I've ever read from the turn of the last century, not this century, on how the development of bandsaws were made, which were developed in 1815, I believe, in England. Okay, sorry. I'm just making sure I'm filming. Okay, so you want ideally your blade to be centered on the wheel. What he's saying is that tension can be created on the blade, and so you want to get the back of the gullet, because that would be the rigid spot. There's only rigidity here. There's only force going up here. There's no force going up here. So by the time you get to the side, there's no rigidity. And what he's claiming is that it's going to somehow control that. Now, as I said, that crown is so narrow, we're talking, or it should be. Now, he's not running a real crown. He's got neoprene tires, which aren't crowned, the tires anyway. The wheel might be crowned. He might be 5 thou. These are proper vulcanized tires. They're properly crowned. They're running concentric, and the crown's very shallow. This is the way they used to do it before products were available. So if we tilt and throw it to the back, it's going to put the blade at the back and not at the bottom. The bottom will stay where it is. There are adjustments on saws, even this one, that can adjust where that blade runs on the bottom wheel, and I can guarantee you want it on the center of the bottom wheel. You don't want it. What? You're going to adjust the track every time you put a new blade on the and those sorts of adjustments are quite tedious. I know Agazzini and the Italian saws have 4 bolts, and you can do all that. You're not going to do that. You want your tire running in the center. So let's do what he said. Let's throw the blade all the way back, even though it will reduce the capacity of your saw because saws are specified by the width of their blade. If this is a 1-inch wheel, I can run a 1-inch blade. That's how the manufacturers. But if I run a 1-inch blade, well, how can I get the crown on a 1-inch blade? The depth of the gullet, maybe 3/4, because there's maybe a 1/4 inch. So I can't use the saw to its capacity, and it does nothing to affect the bottom wheel, which isn't adjustable. Okay? Worst is, if you do that and you run your saw to the back of the wheel, you're going to make this part not square to the table this way. Well, you go, well, so what does that matter? Well, you've got a guide post here which controls all of your guides. So when you raise and lower that, now the distance between your thrust bearing and the back of the fence is constantly changing. It might be pushing forward down here, and it might be way off up here. You don't want that. Unless you like buying thrust bearing guides, or when you hear people cutting and you hear zzz, zzz, that's the old back thrust bearing. If you run it in the center, only on heavy cuts will the back bearing come into play. And it's the back bearing pushing on that beam of the saw that causes it to do what he says it's doing. Lastly, if you're doing what he does, you're putting your saw in a different spot on that wheel each time, and that is going to induce different types of drift. The whole bullshit of, have a fence that adjusts for drift is because you're following instructions like that and putting your saws not on the top of the crown. And when you set up your saw, if you do put your blades in the center, so you maximize their potential, so that they run without pressure applied. If you hang it off the back, when you go to push on the front of that blade, it's hanging on the back. It's wanting to fall off the back. Get it on the crown. All the crown is there for is not for placement of your wheel. It's for tracking. And how it works is the crown is in the largest diameter. The largest diameter spins faster than the smaller diameter, and the blade wants to be there. It wants to be on the very top. Physics. This is just physics. Now, not all saws are crowned. Now, here's a little Japanese resaw, about the size of Snodgrass's Powermatic there. And you can see this is running a 3-inch blade, and it does not have crown tires. In fact, it doesn't even have tires. It's solid steel. And the teeth are actually hanging across the front. The exact opposite of what he's claiming you to do, and this is specifically made to run straight. Okay? So not all saws are crowned, and this is just a tensioning thing. This is tensioning. You want to set your blade where it tracks naturally so that forces pushing on it don't want to push it off the wheel on the crown, which wants to hold it in place. You're going to save all your guides. And, they're all the same. This is from the 60s, this saw. And look at its capacity. It says, sorry, let's see if I can focus in. 1.5 inches, sorry. My camera's not focusing. But if I was, it's only 1.5 inch wheel. Okay? So notice where it's tracking. Right in the center. That's where it wants to be. Okay? No matter where I put that thrust bearing, this whole assembly here, it's going to be perfectly aligned because I'm not shoving this thing on an angle back like this, wanting it to fall off. And guess what, boys? They fall off. That's why there's guards on them. Put them in the center. Don't be silly.